everybody. Hello, everybody. My name's Khalid. I am an intern with the Kheprw Institute. I've been working with them for about 8 months now, and I'm just trying to develop myself before I'm an adult. Um, but today I'm here to introduce Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard. She is teaching at John Jay College, where she educates college students about how communities can be fair and to build strong local economics. She's into something called cooperative economics. This is where people work together to own and run a business, so they can do it. They can work together by making decisions and sharing profit. She also has two. She also has two children and three grandchildren, which her two children helped her without the helped her through her book, Collective Courage. She's known for her book. The book tells a story about how Black Americans create their own businesses throughout history, especially when facing discrimination and poverty. By working together, this was a big part of civil rights movements. Uh, this was a big, oh my gosh, this was a big part of the civil rights movement because it creates strength and independence for Black businesses. Um, and the book is coming up on its 10th anniversary, so woohoo. The fourth wave talks about how Black businesses were very like had to struggle because of money and inequality. So the fourth wave just says not to come together to unite, not just for the money, but because we want to make the world a better place, um, and you just want to see it differently. You don't want to just start a business and be like, oh yes, I'm a Black person that has my business, but you can't like be strong about it. Um, and lastly, she was in the hall, no, the U.S. Hall of Fame for actively being in economic, social economics, and she just helps businesses, Black businesses, for today. So yeah.
Right on, Khalid. I'm so sorry, y'all. I forgot two things. First of all, I need to say the food that you're eating right now by Flavors by Faith. Give it up for her. She couldn't be here today. Yeah, if you haven't gotten to play already, make sure that that gets done. We've also got our faucet in the kitchenette has filtered water if you switch to the cold water. So if you get thirsty, cups up on the table. Go ahead and get you a sip. And for our virtual folks who haven't checked in yet, please put your name, number, and color and one word for how you're feeling in the chat. And then, yeah, we will come back and read those off as we get into the discussion. Are you, Jessica?
Okay, I'm so happy to be here. I actually feel like I'm coming home, even though I've only been here, what, twice? But during COVID, we did 11 months, once a month, book club, and so I felt like I got to know everybody, and um, so really excited to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction. Though I have four grandchildren now, not three. So I have to correct that because my little granddaughter, would never forgive me if I left her out. Um, and very proud of my children and my grandchildren. So thanks for mentioning them also. I do also always do land, ancestor, and earth acknowledgments. So I do want to recognize and remember the original stewards of the land wherever we are, especially inhabitants of North America and Africa, and all the indigenous people who've been exploited and oppressed to enrich colonial and settler powers. Hopefully, I don't get you guys in trouble for talking about that. I want to also acknowledge the African origins of humanity, and remember all our ancestors, acknowledge Mother Earth and our efforts to keep her sustainable and this planet livable. and then acknowledge the struggles of our ancestors as well as histories of resistance, which is what I feel like I'm here to help us talk about, especially economic resistance, but resistance to all forms of asset stripping, anti-blackness, patriarchy, labor oppression, and other exploitations. I also think it's important for us to really recognize how important it is that people resist and restore, and that we've done it throughout our history. And I think for me, cooperatives, economic cooperation, mutual aid cooperatives is a part of that continuous struggle for us to be human beings even when we're in situations that are inhuman. And you'll see some of my newest research, which I'll talk about at the end, is actually looking at the ways being a member of a worker co-op while still in prison can still be transformative, even though people are caged and actually have no human rights. So that's another example of what I mean here. The other thing I want to start out with, I think you all have heard me say, is how universal cooperatives, economic cooperation, mutual aid, every population in every era of human history on every continent practices some form of economic cooperation, mutual aid, solidarity economics. We don't always use those terms. It's not always a formal incorporated structure, but we all do it. I actually now like to talk about economic cooperation being the first form of economics that human beings have practiced. If you look back through our history, so it predates capitalism, and capitalism is actually new and a short-term economic structure. Yet, you know, we live in a society that acts like it's the be-all, end-all only way to live. But, you know, the other reason I love coming to Kheprw is because you all know that's not the only way to live. And you all are practicing other places. Actually, you all are an example of the fourth wave, which we're going to talk about in a second. Sorry, my chair keeps moving out from under me. So let's see. So what I want, so let me get to the fourth wave. So why are we saying a fourth wave? Actually, Maha Selassie is the one who said, oh, that's a fourth wave. I said we were in the fourth most prolific period of black cooperativism. And why did I say that? Because I did find that there were three other most prolific periods. In addition to that, we have a continuous history. African Americans, Black Americans have a continuous history of using mutual aid and economic cooperation since the slave ship, since being forcibly brought here. So it's not that we ever stopped practicing it, but there were three periods of time when we had the most number of formal cooperatives. And those three original periods were the 1880s, which I also like to talk about. And somebody tell me when I'm talking too long. But I have to talk about the 1880s because it was a period of time very similar to what we're in now. It was a backlash period, right? The 1880s was a backlash from the Reconstruction period, which was one of our major civil rights periods in our history after the Civil War, the war between the states. And in the 1880s, right, that's the beginning of Jim Crow apartheid system in the U.S. It's the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist violence. But it was also a time when labor, organized labor, the co-op movement, consumer and worker co-ops and producer co-ops. It was a time when the labor movement and the co-op movements realized that they had to be co-ed. They had to recognize women's rights as well as men's rights, and they had to be integrated. And so you actually had a period, even though we were politically under some of the worst repression in our history, even though the economy wasn't that great, but there was a strong, what they called populist movement of small farmers and the small worker. And there was these very strong labor unions that were also doing cooperative development and merging with other movements. And so it was an important time. A lot of things happened even under all that repression because of the connection of the movements. And so you have groups like the Knights of Labor, that was an integrated union. Um, and they actually ran political campaigns. They started worker co-ops. They started unions. They made sure that women were allowed in the unions and got the same jobs as men. They made sure black and white workers were together. Then you have the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union right after that period, where the black folks decided they needed their own multi-movement organization. So they were also a populist party, a labor union, a co-op developer, and they combined black landowners and black farm workers because they realized there was no point in having two separate organizations supporting black landowners and black farmers. And black farm workers. Black farm workers wanted to be landowners. Black farmers needed other farm hands to help with them, and so they helped them all to connect, to work together, to have more ownership, to have more rights for black workers, and to get prices up for their produce. So that kind of thing was happening, and so the 1880s had a lot of different kinds of farm co-ops, worker co-ops like cotton mill, owned by the workers, things like that. Other factory owned by the workers, construction companies owned by workers, you name it, stores, grocery stores and supply stores, that kind of thing. Even though they were under threat all the time from white competitors and white terrorists. And even though some of their members got lynched and some of their co-ops got burned down, and co-ops weren't allowed to get money from white banks and things like that, they persisted and continued. So it's a really fascinating period of time. So that was what would be the first wave, or the first most prolific period. The second one is the 30s and 40s in the US during the Great Depression. Again, necessity. The economy is bad, but it was also a time when luckily the federal government was supporting co-op development. And so there was some actual federal money to do co-op development, but it was also a time when we had growing black organizations again who saw that it was important to do economic justice and economic power, not just to look at civil rights and political power. And so you had groups like the Young Negroes Cooperative League, you had the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, our first official independent black union. Their Ladies Auxiliary did co-op development. They actually started 16 co-op study groups in the 1930s under the auspices of the Women Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, including opening a credit union in Montreal because they included Canada in their area, in their region. And in the 40s, HBCUs, black schools, were actually teaching cooperative economics and consumer economics. And around those schools, we have evidence of black co-ops developing at the same time, or because the students were being taught those things. We have other evidence of independent black secondary schools teaching cooperative economics to their students and to the families, and starting farm co-ops that way, that kind of thing. So that's the second prolific period. The third was the 60s and 70s. Not so much in economic survival as more connected to social and political agitation and demand for self-determination. So in the 60s and 70s, we also again had strong black organizations who were pushing for co-op development. The 5 major national civil rights organizations quietly behind closed doors helped to organize and fund the Federation of Southern Cooperatives because they realized there needed to be a regional federation of co-ops doing black co-op development. So even though their national policy and stance didn't mention economic stuff, it just mentioned the political, they were behind the scenes making sure that the economic justice piece was there. The Black Panther Party, right, their programs pending political revolution, survival programs pending political revolution, were all co-op and collective activities. Again, they're not as well known for being community developers and doing co-op development and having co-ops, because, you know, most of the publicity they got was about their self-defense programs, but actually when you study them, you see that most of what they were actually engaged in were these community development, collective ownership, cooperatives, free clinics, that kind of thing. And so they were really working on the economic justice just as much, if not more, than they were about criminal justice issues. And lots of other organizations, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was doing co-op development, starting credit unions and farm co-ops and other things, especially again through the South, and a bunch of other groups, which I think, I did write them down. Okay, good. The Poor People's Corporation and the Nation of Islam all were doing co-op development around that time too. So those are the three most prolific periods. They all have similarities, right, about strong black organizations promoting and focusing on co-op development, survival needs that also develop into liberation needs, right? So you might start something because of you need it for survival, but then as you get more and more used to economic cooperation and see its power, you start using it for more self-determination, other kind of liberation. So all those pieces. So then actually after Collective Courage was first published in 2014, I started noticing that the 2020s were actually what I would have called, or what I'm calling, another prolific period for black co-op development. And what's happening now? Well, you see all the work that Kheprw's doing. There's similar local groups all over the country, the Bay Area in California, Cincinnati, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Richmond, Virginia, Richmond, California. Oh, that's the Bay Area. Sorry, I already said that. New York City, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Springfield, Massachusetts all have lots of co-op development activities. Sometimes they've gotten actual municipal money to do worker co-op development, and lots of black organizations. We've actually just started the National Association of Black Cooperators, which has started co-sponsoring National Black Co-op Agenda conferences every year in different parts of the country. So we've got people coming together and working on this. We've got groups like Green Worker Co-ops, Blacks for the Environment, Green Worker Co-ops in the Bronx, Blacks for the Environment in Baltimore. They're actually studying the book too. I think they're on chapter 5 tonight. I just noticed that they have a competing event. So lots of activity, pretty much almost every state that has a significant number of black folks, there seems to be some kind of black cooperation group, right? Oh, New Orleans has one, obviously Jackson, Mississippi. Anyway, you see what I'm saying. So when I started talking about, it's looking now like the 2020s are going to be another prolific period, that's where Amaha said, it sounds like a fourth wave. And I was like, yes. And so now we started talking about the fourth wave. And in the introduction, I think I was here on Zoom talking to you all about the intro to the 10th anniversary. And we talked about that we're in the fourth wave now. Here it is. It was looking like it was a fourth wave, and now it's here. So since we're in the fourth wave, what do we know, right? What have we learned that can help us, do this better, more, longer, right? Maybe it's not going to be a wave anymore. Maybe it's like the future, right? That we're always doing this. So what have we learned? So I have a list of lessons that we learned, and then I want to talk about the ways that co-ops address economic challenges, and then I've got my quiz for you all. I'm going to give you scenarios for how some of the co-ops in history started, and see if you can either talk about how a co-op addresses that, or actually tell me a co-op that I'm specifically thinking about that's connected to that scenario. So we'll do that for a little while and then open it up to question and answer. So the lessons, importance of education, study groups and training. I think most of you who've ever heard me talk, I always say that I realized when I was finishing the book that almost every co-op that I learned anything about how it started with some kind of study group. People coming together and saying, okay, what can we do about this and this and this, or all these problems? What would be a solution that would really make a difference? Somebody either knew or heard about a co-op, or they started studying their options and learned about co-ops and then started studying co-ops together. Sometimes they were very specific, like, as I said, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Ladies Auxiliary knew that they wanted their members to study co-ops. So they didn't find co-ops, they already knew co-ops, and they started bringing people together to talk about, okay, what is a co-op, how could we do it? Co-ops help black communities keep money circulating among black folks. They distribute wealth better, that kind of thing. So let's talk about it, let's learn about it. Some groups did the study and then would start a buying club, and then go from a buying club to an actual retail store and then to other things. So we have lots of examples of the study group helping to create kind of a co-op society and a co-op ecosystem, because you didn't just do one co-op, you did a bunch. So Gary, Indiana was like that. Chicago had some interesting co-ops like that, in North Carolina. So again, people coming together, what are the issues? Why is cooperation, why is economic cooperation a good strategy given all our other options, that kind of thing. And I don't think we can underestimate that importance. And the more that I study co-op study groups, the more that I realize they're important not just for the sharing of information, but the learning together sets a precedent of relationship building and trust building that's going to be essential for actually running a good, strong co-op. So that experience of starting to learn together, work through questions, talk about things together helps you to then figure out how to run your co-op together and how to, you trust each other better, you're used to talking about difficult things. And so it really makes a huge difference. So that's the first lesson. Second lesson is the importance of organizations and organizing. I think if you didn't hear it, I'll say it again. Every single one of those fourth prolific periods had strong black organizations promoting cooperative development and doing cooperative economic education, right? So that's what I mean by the importance of organizations, having organizations of people dedicated to doing this and to help raise money and to make sure their members hear about it is really important. I didn't mention it when I said about the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union in the 1880s, but it was actually, I believe it's still considered to be the largest black organization of its kind in the U.S. And the fact that it wasn't just a populist party and a labor union, but it was also a co-op development organization, we should really be in awe about that. And that's something we could emulate, right? How can we keep making these large black organizations that realize that achieving economic justice through economic democracy is really one of the most important things we can do? And then organizing itself, right? Getting people together, bringing people together, building trust, building relationships, right? We can't underestimate how much that matters too, because co-ops are economic structures that are about human beings, bringing human beings together to create self-determination and to share power and prosperity, right? And so building relationships is going to be really important. And then that feeds into another important lesson about the significance of community support and sense of solidarity. I told you that sometimes it wasn't just the 1880s that co-ops were under attack, but when co-ops have been under attack, the ones that have survived because they've had surrounding community that supported them, whether being their customers, giving them loans, giving them donations, giving them land, or physically protecting them with their bodies or with whatever by any means necessary. Trying to figure out what's the word that won't catch, that Zoom won't catch and either turn us off or put us all in jail or whatever. By any means necessary. I think we can still say that, right? So importance of community and community support. It kind of goes with organizations and organizational support, but it also means even the people who aren't necessarily in your co-op or in the organization, it really matters still. Pooling of resources and leveraging of resources, another one, right? We all still, especially under capitalism, we don't always have the resources of the capital, but co-ops are a way to pool whatever we have, both finance and human energy, resources, pull them together, and then leverage them so that we can do something with them, both leverage them as like buying clubs and be able to buy more because we pooled them, back to the mutual aid idea, or leverage them because sometimes once other groups and other funders see that we have resources and we pooled what we have, they're willing to give us others and see that we're serious, that kind of thing. And then the democratic participation, the internal solidarity and trust, the working together, making decisions together, when it works right, is just so powerful. And again, toward the end, I'll tell you about some of my experiences with interviewing previous members of a co-op while they were in prison, and their stories about how it brought them back their humanity and how the model itself forced them to interact with each other and with other people in a way that re-engaged them in the world. Then you really see the power of co-ops about how democratically, respectfully, humanly relating to each other in economics can make a huge difference. And I don't think I have to tell you how traumatizing capitalism is, right? It's actually just the opposite. It makes us fight each other, hate work, right? Just scramble to get our own. And so we're always being alienated from ourselves as human beings who are really social beings who care about other people. But when we're in, capitalist economic systems, we're not allowed to care about even ourselves or other people, right? We're just got to get that money, got to beat everybody else. And so it dehumanizes us. But cooperative, the democratic participation part of being in a cooperative business really is very humanizing, and especially in times when we need to remember that we're human beings and have ways that we can act as human beings and engage as human beings makes a huge difference. And then the last lessons, the role of women, black women, in the black co-op movement and actually in the U.S. co-op movement in general was phenomenal. As I started putting together the research, I suddenly realized one day I kind of looked at it and I said, oh my God, there's women all over this place. Usually, especially as an economist, you're just studying what men do. And sorry, men, I don't mean that badly, but it's discouraging because in my life I know that women do a lot. Sometimes they do more. And yet, in economics, we don't really get to study what women do. But when I studied black co-ops and the black co-op movement, the women were right there all the time, sometimes in the very front. If they couldn't be in the very front, they were right there next to or right behind, driving things. And I even have great quotes from black cooperators talking about how important the women's roles and the women's activities were. And then if you look at, and I shouldn't have been surprised because the people who study mutual aid that I learned from actually mention that also. In the black mutual aid movements, I think some of the studies I found said 60 to 70% of black mutual aid societies are run by women, started by women, whatever. And it's very similar in the co-op movement. And so we know that women as nurturers, right, as community activists, et cetera, we shouldn't be surprised that there's such a strong role for them, especially black women. But as I said, it was surprising as an economist because we don't usually see it. Oh, sorry, I touched the mic. Oh, he's not here. Okay. So that was really important. And then the participation of youth. I also was excited, right, to learn about the Young Negroes Cooperative League in the 30s and youth co-ops that I learned about in the 80s and the 2000s. Really exciting. I mean, that's the cutting edge. That's right? Not just the fourth wave that we're all doing this, but the fact that young people are interested. You guys have, Kheprw is great about the intergenerational and bringing the young people. And the youth co-ops are really exciting because it's also a chance for young people to see a problem in their communities and figure out a solution that includes them, again, having agency, self-determination, running their own businesses in a way that helps the community, helps everybody, and in a way that provides the economic democracy and justice that hopefully they're hoping for, and they can actually start to achieve it. And so those are kind of some of the main lessons learned. If you look at all those pieces, you can see why this would be a fourth wave, because it has elements of all those pieces. I'm sure it has more, but you get the idea. So let me move a little faster. So some of the economic challenges that co-ops address: market failure, export of capital, predatory lending, unemployment, poor quality education, housing crisis, food insufficiency, food deserts, poor nutrition, prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, climate change, heteropatriarchy. And really, I can give you examples of co-ops that address all of those things. We have consumer co-ops to give consumers more control over what they buy and what they have access to. They're community-owned businesses that tend to be localized so they can address the capital flight issues. Credit unions are financial cooperatives that address our need for access to capital and fair financial services. Worker co-ops address the unemployment issues and the exploitation issues of workers and labor. There's co-op schools, but also all co-ops believe in continuous education and have to make sure their members have enough information to make good decisions, since we're all making decisions together in a co-op. So the education piece is there, both directly and indirectly. Housing co-ops and credit unions address housing crisis problems. Food co-ops, agricultural co-ops, urban agricultural co-ops, health co-ops address the nutrition and the health and the food access problems. Worker and social co-ops address the mass incarceration problems, and the sustainability values of co-ops, the ability to do co-ops in green industries, and alternative energy co-ops help to address the climate change. So let's look through history about some of these issues. So I'm going to give you a scenario. If anybody already read that part and knows the co-op I'm talking about, you can throw it out there, or if you just want to throw out what could be a co-op solution in that case. So we'll start out 1865. The Civil War is ending. We're in Maryland, in Baltimore, Maryland. And Maryland, hopefully you all know, was a slave state that stayed in the Union. So Maryland had enslavement up until the 13th Amendment, when it was officially abolished. Actually, there was a law passed first, but anyway, we won't go through all those details. Anyway, Maryland is just about to abolish the slavery in the state. And so instead, they pass a new law which says that skilled black workers cannot hire themselves out. They still have to work under a journeyman or a master in terms of the skilled labor classes. So not master in the sense of a white master, because that's just about to be outlawed. But they pass this law, so it's a very regressive law, because especially the stevedores and caulkers in Baltimore are known, the black stevedores and caulkers are known to be the best trained in their field as caulkers and et cetera. And so they don't want the black folks to be able to get all the bids and all that kind of stuff. So what do the black folks in Baltimore do?
You can just raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic.
I don't remember which chapter it's in. Nobody?
I don't remember the specific name of the co-op, but they created their own cooperative, like shipbuilding, dry dock.
Yep. perfect. Chesapeake Marine and Railway Dry Dock. And they lasted for 18 years as essentially a worker co-op, but I think they probably were a little bit of what we would now call a multi-stakeholder co-op, because a bunch of black middle class also bought into so they could start the co-op, but it was it was to allow the stevedores and caulkers to have their own company so they wouldn't have to apprentice themselves to a white master. At its height, it hired between 100 and 200 stevedores and caulkers, and after the first few years, an integrated workforce. So they integrated the unions. Originally, the stevedore and caulker unions weren't even integrated, but because the co-op was hiring both sets, they eventually were able to integrate the union. And the other little piece that I like about that example is, again, you guys are probably not history buffs like I am, but Frederick Douglass, who hopefully you all know who he is, in his first autobiography, he talks about how he stole a spelling book from a white boy and ran off and sat at the steps of one of the shipyards in Baltimore. So guess which shipyard the Chesapeake Marine and Railway Dry Dock Co-op bought? They bought the one that had the steps that Douglass had talked about 20 years earlier, having sat on and taught himself to read. So they connected back to their culture and history, in addition to making sure that all these stevedores and caulkers had real work that they could control themselves. All right, nice job, thank you. Okay, Washington, D.C., 1932 maybe. I'm not sure if I have the date exactly, but the 1930s, Washington, D.C., black women, housewives are destitute, and black women, domestic workers, can't find jobs.
Pull down the slideshow so we can see folks in the Zoom room. Folks in the Zoom room, please feel free to jump in on these questions as well. Raise your hand. Come off mute. Can they hear me now? Folks on Zoom, please feel free to jump in on any of these questions as well. Raise your hand. Come off mute. And for everybody, there are no wrong answers.
Nobody? A hint? Nanny Helen Burroughs had something to do with it? Does that help? Okay. Cooperative Industries of DC. It starts out being called the Northeast Self-Help Co-op. It's a co-op started by Nanny Helen Burroughs and, oh shoot, I always forget the name of the other woman. I've got to remember her.
Asia McGinnis asked in the chat, did these women sew?
Yes.
Hey.
Sewing was one of their major occupations.
Right
Thank
on,
you.
Asia.
They also were doing broom making and canning. And if you know Nanny Helen Burroughs, she started the National Training School for Black women and girls in Washington, D.C., and she allowed them to use the basement to do the co-op activity. So the basement of that school had a room for broom factory, a sewing room for sewing with sewing machines and sewing and hand sewing, and room for canning. She also applied for several federal grants under the FDR administration's self-help co-ops movement. And finally, after the third try, she got enough money, so they bought a farm out in Maryland. And so then they did farming and farm-to-table activities, and then a co-op grocery store. So they started out as a worker co-op with owned by the women workers, but they eventually became a multi-stakeholder co-op doing agricultural farming co-op, marketing, and a grocery co-op. They deliberately set aside, I think it was 10% of their revenues to do more education, and she started some education classes in the school that she ran. But her major purpose for this was not just the survival of women and their families during the Great Depression, but she also said women needed to be engaged in production rather than domestic service, because production was a way for them to control their labor better, especially through a co-op. It paid better, and it was safer. She was very worried about domestic servants being sexually preyed upon and not being paid, especially during the Great Depression. Often they would work for a week, and then the employer would say, oh, we don't have any money to pay you. So she was, let's do our own co-ops. You need to be in co-ops. You can control your own work and be safer both physically and financially. All right, next. South Bronx, 1980. Home care workers can't get good full-time jobs with benefits. So what do? By now, you guys should be able to guess. This is what I tell my students all the time. Sometimes, you can do an educated guess.
I feel like this is easy now. They started a co-op. But is this the same co-op that exists today that's still doing the same work? Okay, so it's been like 40 years?
1986.
Oh, wow.
Something like that.
Okay.
So, yeah, almost 40 years. Yeah, you don't remember the name of it?
I don't know the name. Apologies.
Nobody online's got it? Oh, Cooperative Home Care Associates. So this is mostly black and brown home care aides. It starts out with home care aides. Their purpose is to provide high quality work for home care aides and high quality care for the elderly and for people who need them. So it's a worker co-op. They also realized early on that to do high quality care, they needed high quality training. So they actually created a nonprofit training arm and trained all their member owners through their own training arm. They worked with other home care groups in New York City to make sure that New York State allocated enough money from Medicare and Medicaid that they could all be paid living wages. And of course, it's a company that the workers own themselves, so they get dividends every year that the company is profitable, which is actually every year after the second year. They get dividends on their membership, as well as full-time work. So even if a job for one person doesn't give them 40 hours, the co-op combines that work with another job to give them their whole 40 hours. They have benefits, which they never used to get before, vacation time, retirement. They're enrolled in a retirement plan. They also got banked if they weren't banked. The co-op helped them to get banked so they could get direct deposit, and they're unionized. So actually it was the union that allowed them, being a member of the union allowed them to buy affordable health care. So they also have full health care coverage, sick leave, etc. So really interesting, and as we said, 40-year-old co-op. All right. Young people in Worcester, Massachusetts in the 2000s, their siblings are getting lead poisoning from playing in their backyards. Come on, the educated guess.
I'll guess that they started a health cooperative or a youth cooperative to address backyard lead poisoning or just testing.
Yes, a youth co-op, so they run it themselves. Toxic soil busters. They do lead abatement landscaping and lead poisoning in brownfields education. And so they first started learning about it themselves. They joined an environmental justice project. They learned how to do soil testing, and then what kinds of plants would pull the lead out of the soil, and how to do raised bed, landscaping, and other kinds of landscaping. in order to get work, they realized they had to let more people know about brownfields and lead poisoning, and so they started doing skits and performances to explain to people what the problem was. So they also, their co-op then started doing video creation and video production. So they started their own video production unit in addition to the landscaping they were doing. And these are young people in high school who are doing this. One of the young people I interviewed years ago. Okay. One of the young people I interviewed years ago said to me, because I was asking them what was kind of the hardest thing, and I thought they were going to talk about running a company, right? They said the hardest thing was, here they were, you know, after school and in the summers, they were running their own company and doing all this advocacy and that kind of thing, but they still, when they went to high school, they still had to raise their hand to go to the bathroom.
So I just wanted to know, does anybody know what plant takes out lead?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you know the answer?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep the mic then.
Okay.
Takes out the lead. What are some of the lead abatement plants?
Does anybody know what plant takes out lead?
Sunflowers?
Somebody said sunflowers, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I can't.
Something really common. Like something I know that I just can't like. It's gotta be common.
Who are you?
I'm Sarah.
Oh,
Sorry.
hi.
It's gotta be something like a sunflower, like cilantro or something easy like that.
Right, yeah, actually, yeah, they're saying yes, that's right, and then somebody else. Thank you.
Kheprw and wheat or corn could also take out lead out of soil.
Great. Okay, should we do one more? I actually have a bunch.
I have a
more.
point.
Okay, go ahead.
You may not know, we may not know here in Indianapolis that we weren't behind in forming a way to work together. We had, and you may have heard of it, it's the Columbia Conserve Company. 1917 to 1943, it was in Barrington, over on the south side of Churchman and the Belt Railroad, and the workers formed a company and a union, and they prepared and canned food, and it was a worker-owner co-op.
Oh,
Yeah,
excellent.
the Columbia Conserve Company, and I'll talk to you later about that.
Sounds great, thank you. Yeah, the example I have in Indiana was in Consumer Cooperative Trading Company in Gary. That's the only Indiana example I had, so thank you so much for adding that one. Okay, let me do one more question, and then I can tell you about my new research, and then we'll open it up. Do we still have time?
Yes.
Okay, so you're in a Puerto Rican prison, and you just had a year's worth of art therapy, and you and the other people in the art therapy class have been making all these sculptures, and your families are telling you they don't need any more. What do you do?
So, I assume you make it go off, like where you like do like markets or something like that. That would be my like current thought process in the current economy. But I actually did something like this in London. They have a mental health charity where they do markets like that specifically for mentally ill people that it's not prisons, but it's like kind of similar. Your mind is a prison sometimes. And they got to sell their art and find a safe haven through that in London, which I think is really interesting because we don't really have anything like that here. I feel like it's kind of a co-op in a way.
Right. Great. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and the U.S. proper doesn't really have any examples yet, but we're working on it. So they actually formed a worker co-op, not just a marketing scheme. They organized themselves into a worker co-op. The first problem when I interviewed some of them, they said they wanted to organize as a co-op. They didn't just want to do marketing or do a small business. They wanted to be a co-op because they wanted to recognize that many of the sculptures were a joint project. Some of them, some of the time, one person would carve the sculpture, another one would paint it, another one would make the pedestal, and so they wanted to recognize the joint work, but they also wanted an economic structure that was in service of people and that gave back to the community and was not just a regular capitalist extractive business. But they found out that in Puerto Rico, and I believe in a lot of the states in the U.S., you cannot incorporate a co-op that is wholly owned by incarcerated people. Incarcerated people couldn't be, especially members of the board, which is the governing body of a co-op, and in some cases they can't even be an owner of a co-op. So they actually first had to get an audience with the governor at the time, who then put them in touch with this, the League of Puerto Rican Co-ops, and with members of the state legislature, or whatever it's called since it's a commonwealth. And they finally convinced the legislature to change the law, and they got the law changed so that they could incorporate as a wholly owned co-op with incarcerated people, and that they could handle their own finances and marketing, because often when you're incarcerated, you're actually not allowed to have connections with the outside world, and you're not allowed to handle any money. But once they incorporated as a co-op, the co-op laws in Puerto Rico and the co-op supporters in Puerto Rico who were helping them all said that co-ops are audited every year to make sure that they're handling their funds properly, that co-op members and the treasurer of the co-op are handling the funds and that kind of thing. And so this co-op, incorporated as a co-op in Puerto Rico, couldn't have some outsider handling their money, which would have been one of the prison officers, because that's usually, if you do have any money, that's usually how it happens. So they got a lot of different changes done in what they're able to do. They lasted about 12 years. Actually, they only stopped because during COVID, their prison got closed down, and then the members that were still there got separated out into different prisons. And since COVID, they haven't been allowed to start up again yet. But they were able to, they had a lot of support from the co-op community in Puerto Rico. I just wrote an article about it because of how impressed I was both with how articulate the guys that I interviewed were about the difference the co-op made in their life, but also how strong the support from the Puerto Rican League of Cooperatives and other co-ops in Puerto Rico. They gave them free training with co-op educators. They gave them access to credit union accounts. They worked with them to get the equipment they needed, and most of their sales were done by going to co-op meetings and selling to other co-ops. And then one of the co-ops, which was a cafe that was actually outside the walls of the prison but run and owned by some of the prisoners, the cafe, actually most of their suppliers were other co-ops. So there's just this whole, what we call a co-op ecosystem. But I'll leave you, before you ask me questions, with some quotes from some of the guys I interviewed who are now out. These are some of the first early presidents of the co-op while they were in prison. Oh, that was another really interesting thing. They said they were voted in as president because they had 99 plus year sentences. And so the members thought, okay, we should vote as the leaders, the people who we know are going to be here for a long time, right? But all of them got out within 10 years of being in the co-op and got their sentences commuted because their behavior changed so drastically after they joined the co-op and became a co-op member. And so they got out for good behavior, after 10 years instead of being there for the rest of their lives. And they all said that, being a member of a co-op was just transformative. One guy, I never imagined that working in a co-op I'd find the ideal model to rehabilitate myself. Being in a co-op changes your lives and we're just not the same. Another guy said, actually he made me cry. He said that it changed the paradigm. It changed his whole way of seeing himself because it changed how other people saw him. So when he went out to the co-op meetings to sell their statues, the other co-op people saw him. He said they didn't see me as a thief. They didn't see us as thieves. They saw us as artists and co-op leaders. And that meant that he could see himself differently. And so that made a huge difference. And he was one of the ones, I forget, they had a name for him because he had memorized all the Puerto Rican co-op laws. So whenever the prison officers questioned whether they could do this or whether he could do that, he would read them, the co-op law and say, according to co-op law, I'm the president. I'm supposed to have access to the books. Me and the treasurer, we're supposed to be the ones to sign, and the credit union checkbooks have to be in our care because we have to attest to it every year that we get audited. And so they finally let him actually keep the books in their office. They rented an office. They actually paid up to 20% of their revenues to the prison to cover office space, electricity, extra guards, all that kind of stuff. So they were paying their way. In fact, when Puerto Rico was on austerity, the warden called them in and said, oh, you know what, we're not going to be able to let you go out. They used to have a memorandum to go out and sell their wares at the co-op conferences, and they would pay for 2 guards to go with them. And the warden said to them, oh, we're all under austerity. We can't afford to let you go out anymore. So they were like, that doesn't sound right, whatever. They went back and had a meeting, and they were like, wait a second, we're paying the prison for all this. The prison doesn't pay. We bring in money for the prison. The prison doesn't pay us anything, or doesn't pay for any of these things. We cover all our expenses. So they went back, and they reminded him that they were bringing revenue into the prison and that they paid all the traveling expenses. And so the warden said, oh, I guess you're right. I guess you can still go out and sell your stuff. So that kind of thing really changed their lives, changed the way that they operated, the way they saw themselves, as well as the way other people saw them and the way they operated. And they were able to send home money to their families. One of the guys brought his wife and teenage daughter to the interview with him. And when I asked them about whether they were making more money and how it was to be able to make enough money to send home to their families, the guys were like, oh, yeah, but the real thing is how our lives were changed. But the wife said the money helped a lot. So they weren't, they didn't want to talk too much about the money because they didn't think that was the most important thing. But it was the whole package, I think, was important. So hopefully you see why I get so excited about co-ops. Should I stop? Questions? Oh, my new research. So studying incarcerated worker co-ops around the world and previously incarcerated worker co-ops here in the U.S. is my new research. So those interviews I did in Puerto Rico with Cooperative Aragos, that was the name. Cooperative de Servicio Aragos is the name of that co-op, though I murdered the Spanish. I'm sorry about that. But also for co-op inside prisons, as I said, the U.S. doesn't have them, but there's another really interesting one in Ethiopia, in the Mekelle prison. Actually, I just heard those are closed down too, but they were also lasted about 10 or 15 years in the Tigray state of Ethiopia. That one was also interesting because it was part of a women and youth empowerment program between the state and the corrections department. And so what they did was co-op education. They also did financial literacy and finance education, and they had a micro lender on the campus, on the prison, in the prison, within the prison walls, to give loans to co-op development. And they passed laws that allowed imprisoned people to be in co-ops and to do marketing with the outside world. And they created about 30 over their 15-year period. There were about 30 co-ops created inside their prison, and because they were doing women and youth empowerment, they were doing a combination of heavy industry like pavement making and brick making and electrical work, as well as catering and sewing and stuff. And the two really fascinating things about that experience, that example, is that if you were released from prison, you actually could still be a member of your co-op and do a reverse commute. So you could live outside of the prison walls, but go in during the day to be part of your co-op, to do your co-op work. And they also trained some of their corrections officers to be co-op developers, which I think is fascinating. So instead of just being police and harassing the prisoners, they were actually helping to train them to run their co-ops. So that was fascinating. There's a co-op in Winnipeg, Canada, called Inside Art, again, artists. This one is also interesting because it was a hybrid, artists inside the prison and supportive business and other artists outside the prison. And so the outside members of the co-op made sure the insiders had all the materials they needed and all that kind of stuff, and then did the marketing and kept the books and all that from the outside. And then if you did get out, you were still a member of the co-op, so you didn't have to find another job. So that was another interesting one. Unfortunately, they never became self-sufficient, so they lost their final funding and they went under. But I still think it's a really interesting model. Did you have your hand up? Oh. Yeah, they were still in the co-op, right? They just had operated from a different geography in the co-op. So that one was also seamless. So those, and then I've also been studying, in the US we do have co-ops of previously incarcerated people, and I just recently have been studying them. Chai Fresh Kitchen in Chicago is one of my favorite examples. They opened during COVID to do meal prep for people who need meals. So during COVID, of course, lots of people needed them. Now they mostly do schools and elderly care, but they're mostly women and mostly previously incarcerated women. They also realized that having a good job as a worker co-op, they also needed good housing, so they now have a housing co-op. They started a housing co-op, but they need another one, so they're about to start a second housing co-op. They also realize they want an ecosystem of support, so they're starting a snack making co-op that can also have the snacks they'll use in their meals, in the meal preps that they make. And they're, I think, trying to seed some other co-ops, so trying to create a whole ecosystem. So that's really interesting. There was a trucking co-op in Tennessee with previously incarcerated people. In Vermont, there's a compost co-op with previously incarcerated people. All of them are realizing they also need to match housing with the worker co-op, so they're doing housing co-ops as well. So that's my most recent research. So you also see why there's this fourth wave, right? There's a lot of new co-op activity happening.
So, can you hear me? Everybody hear me? So, all of this is very, very interesting, and I have a couple of related questions that I'm interested in your reaction to, response to. So, one, the first thing that I think about when I'm listening to you talk about the cooperatives, their impact, and so forth, is what are the key economic variables that support replication and scaling of cooperative economic approaches, and how do we scale this more in the community? How do we get network effects and grow this? Because kind of the question I kind of find myself asking is why it seems to me, it's uninformed, that cooperative economics has not scaled within our community. Maybe that's not accurate. Maybe they have. And you talked about things like credit unions, which is that's fairly common. So that's a cooperative economics kind of activity. Now I belong to a credit union, and I don't feel very much like it's what you're describing. I feel it's a bank. That's kind of how it feels to me. So what are those key economic variables to scaling and replication, and how do we intentionally scale cooperative economics? And if there's something, is there something that's getting in the way that we've had 3 eras of it, but it has not scaled?
Right. So let's start with the barriers. I hate to focus on them, so let's get them over with, and then talk about the elements that do allow scaling and help us to scale. So the first barrier is definitely ignorance and ideology, right? Enough people don't really know about or understand cooperative economics or co-ops, and so we often either think, if it's not capitalism and I'm not going to make my millions, why bother? Or we've been led to think that they're not feasible, right? That economic democracy doesn't work and they're not feasible. We also, live in a society where we're encouraged to be individualistic and to assume that we shouldn't depend on other people, and that depending on other people makes us weak, right? So that's what I mean by ideology. I don't just mean like politics. I mean all that individualism and right. So we don't trust ourselves to be social human beings on the economic side, right? We don't think that it's feasible. We don't think we're going to get enough out of it. So those are barriers. And then we don't know, right? We're not taught, right? You're taught to be capitalists, right? I don't know if you guys have heard me with my rant against kindergarten, but it starts in kindergarten. If any of you, I used to be an elementary school teacher, and kindergarten is basically where we make sure that children abandon their notions of fairness and cooperation, except when they play, right? So in kindergarten, yes, you're supposed to share toys and you're supposed to cooperate with each other when you play, but when you get to the serious stuff, like learning, right? No, right? It's cheating if you consult with somebody, right? And you don't really pass kindergarten if you haven't learned how to keep your hands to yourself, sit and listen to the teacher and regurgitate what the teacher says, right? That's what kindergarten is about, training young people to get rid of all their humanity, right, and get ready to be little cogs, to learn what the capitalists need us to learn and to become good workers, right? So we already start out at a disadvantage. We're taught the opposite of what it means to be a capitalist, and the human cooperative solidarity instincts and attitudes that we have are pretty much beaten out of us. So then we have to so the first thing is we have to re-educate. That's why it was so important that all those co-ops I found started with study groups, right? We've got to learn how to think together, work together, act together. We've got to learn that this model is a viable model, but it is true that economic democracy is harder than hierarchical management, where you just have 1 or 2 people who tell you what to do and whatever, right? It's harder to make decisions together. It's harder to work together, especially when we're in a system that doesn't. So it's not a simple, easy thing to do, but we do see that when we do it, we actually the model can be superior. Like, we know that worker co-ops, people are more productive when they're in a worker co-op. Once people learn how to make decisions together and how to have more control over their work, they actually do it better, do it more, would prefer to be in that kind of a thing. So, the first thing is to make sure that and then there used to be financing troubles. It was hard to get money to do this, but actually in the 2020s, there's actually a lot more money if people knew about it. There's more co-op funds and more access to funding. So the funding problem isn't as bad as it used to be. But But it also used to be that even a regular bank wouldn't loan to a group of co-owners in the same way that they would to other businesses. But we have a lot more leeway there. And then the other barrier, like you say, credit unions. Yeah, a lot of credit unions don't operate as if they were a co-op, even though that is their structure. There's just a small group of people who vote for, I mean, I'm sure you all, do you listen when your credit union sends you a ballot to vote for the board? Do you run for the board, right? Right? We don't. I mean, I even usually throw my ballot away because I don't know the people who are running. And I don't have time to run myself or whatever. So I feel bad. Actually, every year that I throw my ballot away, I feel bad because I'm like, I know better. But you know what? I'm too busy. I don't know who these people are, so why should I vote for people I don't know? But I should get to know my people. I should read up about them. I should get me and my friends to run, or I should find out who else is in my same credit union. You know what I mean? And some of the smaller credit unions do better. But the biggest problem with a credit union is, right, we don't demand, as members of the credit union, we don't demand more transparency and more democracy, and we don't participate. So some of it's on us, but also a lot of the credit unions don't make a big deal about it, right? And they should. They should have happy hours, right, so we can meet the board. They should have other meeting, and in some other places, countries around the world, the co-ops actually have more than just an annual meeting. They meet like have members meet like once a month or quarterly or whatever. I feel like in the U.S. we should probably do that too, because it's so easy, even when you're in a co-op, not to be connected. So finding ways that we could get together more, know each other more, get people excited about running for the board and voting on policies, things like that. So the last thing I'll say about scaling, so we need to do more education. We need to be out there. We need to be more storytelling, because I find, and I guess you see I kind of focused on that this time, telling the stories and giving the case studies resonate more to people than me just saying, oh, you can do it and this is how the structure is or whatever. I didn't really tell you guys exactly how every co-op that we talked about operated, because I thought the story of why they started and how they managed and what they succeeded at doing was more important. There's lots of people now out there and lots of websites that can tell you actually how to do it, how to incorporate, how to do it. But for me, the motivation behind it and what we gain from it is how I think people will enter, right, and why. So I think we need a lot more of the storytelling, the sharing. There's also a lot of, in Black history, because it was dangerous often to be in a co-op and we got co-opted and sabotaged, I also realized as I was doing this research that lots of times we practiced it without calling it that to protect it. But that meant our children and our neighbors didn't really know we were in a co-op and so thought it was more alien than it is, which was another kind of purpose for me of why I felt like I needed to get the word out and talk to people about because I noticed a lot of families, they might even have been in a co-op, but they didn't come home and call it the co-op. And they didn't, right? And so then their children grew up not realizing, unless you tell them about how a co-op operates, and then a lot of people would come up to me and say, oh, you know what, my aunt and uncle, my grandparents, I realize now it was a co-op now that I hear you talk about how it works and all that kind of stuff, but they never called it that. So I think that's the other thing we've been afraid to name it. Even when we practice it, we feel alienated. And then the other way to scale, and again here has been a problem because, and I see your hand, just give me, oh, okay, sorry. For scaling, I really honestly believe this ecosystem development that I said worked in Puerto Rico for the incarcerated worker co-ops. I really think the more we can recognize that groups of us can have interlocking co-ops, and successful co-ops should be supporting new co-ops, that's really also a way to scale. And for me, scaling doesn't mean huge co-ops. It means more small co-ops that support each other and whatever. So if credit unions, I actually I had a 5-year period before COVID where I was going to all kinds of credit union meetings and annual conferences and stuff and telling them, credit unions should be marketing and funding worker co-ops and other co-ops and helping to support them. And then, unfortunately, some of them told me that credit union law doesn't really allow them. They're only allowed to have 11% of their services be to commercial businesses. All the rest has to be residential people, right? So they couldn't do as much as I was saying. There was some other, I forget what there was some other barrier in the way. But again, in other countries, some of the credit unions are the place where they're doing research and development for what the new industry should be and how to do co-ops. They're doing co-op development funds. In Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican League of Co-ops has all these funding sources in addition to the education that they do to help. And then they also have, they have 2 big insurance co-ops that help provide insurance for the new worker co-ops. And right, so we need more of that kind of interlocking work and support from the co-ops that are already existing and already. There's also a great example, the Arizmendi Bakeries in the Bay Area in California. They have a wonderful structure, which they took their first, they took an existing worker co-op pizzeria bakery that was willing to donate. I think they started out with 20% of their profits back into this development group, which would then use their business model to start more co-ops like them. But it's all internal money, so each new co-op then gives back some money to the development arm, so they don't have to go finding the money to do this. They just use the successful businesses to keep creating more and more. So I think right now they have 8 bakeries based on this model, and every single bakery gives a certain percentage of its profits every year back into the pot so they can create more. They're also thinking about starting housing co-op now. They tried to start a construction co-op that had some snags, but they're about to start doing some other businesses now. They do co-op education. We actually tried to get them into San Quentin because we have a project now with doing co-op education and trying to get a co-op started in San Quentin prison, and they were going to help sponsor the worker co-op cafe that was in there. Unfortunately, they didn't get the bid, but so there's lots of ways that this interconnections, right? So getting the word out, getting the education, making sure we have some secured funding, which, as I said, is not as big a problem anymore, and then just pushing the interlocking, right? Do one co-op, then do another, solve this problem first, then that problem. And as I said, we're in a 4th wave now, so I see groups doing this. There's more groups than ever doing co-op education. There's more groups than ever that understand co-op funding and are willing to fund co-ops. There's a whole network, Seed Commons, doing what we call non-extractive funding, which means you take out a loan, but you don't pay it back until paying it back won't hurt your business. So until you're solvent enough so that paying back the loan won't hurt you. And then they want you to pay back the loan because that money can then be used for another loan, but they don't want the loan to bankrupt you or whatever. So that's what they mean by non-extractive lending. There's more donation money, foundation money is increasing. So now we need to get the education out and get these co-ops connected to each other and, supplying each other, helping each other form, connecting with each other. And I think we can scale it up more. We have been. There's more worker co-ops in the U.S. than ever, I think, in our history right now, often started by Latinas. So I feel very positive, even though, as I said, we're, in another politically repressive period. But that's like the 1880s, and the 1880s was phenomenal when you look at the co-op development, so we can do that too. And sometimes, again, you can do it under the radar and then get solid enough and big enough that it's too late once people see you. But also, because we're in a repressive period, co-ops also get started because of the need, because people are struggling, trying to survive, and so it's also this confluence of we have more and more groups doing this, but we also have more and more need for a different kind of structure that co-ops can provide, and also some kinds of co-ops don't seem as people don't see as threatening as other kind of co-ops, right? So sometimes they're seen as another kind of private investment, private industry or whatever, and so some politicians and stuff allow them. So I think the biggest thing is we need to go out there and keep talking to each other and keep using the co-op model as a solution to things and keep interlocking the model. And I feel confident that we can grow, kind of like I've been using a blizzard metaphor, right? How does a blizzard start? With just snowflakes, right? There's snow flurries, snowflakes, right? But then overnight, right, when you wake up the next morning, there's snow everywhere.
Sharita, and then let's do Kheprw.
So I just have a quick question. In Indianapolis, there was a big, hairy debate about this grocery store that went up. And one of the things that was stated to us was that, well, the research suggested that a co-op would not have worked. So in your research, did you find times that a co-op just wasn't feasible for the problem or as a solution to the problem?
Yes and no. Trying to think, should I answer the no or the yes first? So the yes, sometimes if the co-op development isn't done well, then it's not feasible. So there was a co-op grocery store that didn't recently, like in the last 10 years or something, that didn't succeed. And actually everybody was surprised because they had enough funding. That wasn't their problem. When they did the DNA, when they tried to look at the DNA of what happened, to look at the details of what happened, they had people who signed up as members. They had enough money to build a beautiful new store. But what they weren't able to do was to get people to buy at the co-op. So even though they had signed up to be members, they didn't buy. And part of the problem was that they didn't realize they were competing with Dollar General, which was down the street and had groceries. And so because they didn't realize they had to compete with Dollar General, they weren't able, the pricing wasn't competitive, and they hadn't done the marketing about why people should pay a little bit more than they were paying at Dollar General and what the long-term benefits were going to be. So they closed before they realized all that. They only found out of competition after they started asking people questions, after they realized they had to close. So they didn't really, but there was another example about 10 years earlier of a co-op that I personally interviewed some of the members of, and before they opened a very small co-op grocery store. Before they opened, they actually pounded the pavement. I forget how many 10-block radius or something around their store, because they were nervous that the store was going to be too small to be helpful to the neighbors. And so they asked the neighbors what they would buy at a corner. I mean, they weren't really a corner store, but if you were going to walk, if you could walk to us, what would you buy? And they made sure to have everything that people said they wanted in a local store on the shelves the day they opened. So they were very cognizant of both the organizing project and the listening to make sure that they were very relevant to the people that they assumed were going to be their customers. and they also struggled a little bit, but they're still in business now after 20, 25 years or something. And so for me, that organizing strategy they did and that kind of listening, instead of just assuming that if people signed up as a member that that would be enough, right? They wanted to show that they were going to be very responsive and they wanted to be relevant in that sense. And I'm not really saying the other group wasn't relevant, but that they somehow they missed something, right? So that's another. So for me, the answer is you got to do your homework even more diligently than you would think. You've got to be that. Remember I said early on about that connection to community? You've got to have that connection to community. The more the community knows about you and what your plans are and what your hopes are, right? And then the more you can educate people about healthy food and why it's important. And then I think probably in some places you might need some subsidies so that you can start out with low prices until you can convince people that the higher price is worth it because, you know, the food is better than this and that and healthier, right? So you might have to plan ahead, get some grants or something to make sure you have the money. But also some of the grocery store models, I remember there's now a whole black caucus of black grocery stores, and one of the complaints they had was the co-op grocery store models always said that you shouldn't open in a low-income community. You shouldn't open a grocery co-op in a low-income community because low-income people will never allocate enough money to keep the store going or whatever. And so, yeah, but that's technically, I mean, even the group that used to say that, I thought they gave it up because when I called them out on it several years ago, they said they stopped saying that. So I don't know why in this case they're still saying that, or maybe some of the people are still saying that, but yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 And then you have to think out of the box. Right. Those you need to think about, so how can we get people who don't necessarily have enough money or who wouldn't usually allocate this kind of money to groceries or whatever, what do we do? And is there, right, do we have to subsidize? Do we have to do that? But there's lots of out-of-the-box thinking. One of the things I love about co-ops is they're very flexible models. You can look at what you have and what you need and figure out a co-op way to do it. But you have to be willing.
Cadwell, and maybe one or two more after that. Okay, hold on. Let's see the mic real quick. While we get Cadwell's mic set up, I'm going to read some of the comments from the chat. Eric DeLuca says, Dollar General case. Does gap equal not having done market study as an early, does that gap equal not having done market study as an early step?
You know, they thought they did do a market study. So I'm not an expert at what failed in that case, but it sounds like even the market study didn't get to the details, right? Because somehow they didn't know that they were competing with Dollar General. So even though they did do some level of market study and they asked people, and as I said, they got people to sign up as members, but they didn't get people to use the store enough. So somehow they needed to do more, I think, more organizing, I think probably would have been the answer there. And maybe they needed to do interviews, not just a survey, so they could really ask more deeper questions. But again, to me, we got to see this as organizing, right? Co-op development is organizing. And what does organizing mean? I'm talking about real grassroots, Ella Jo Baker, SNCC kind of organizing. You really know, right? Go to people, talk to them a million different times, talk to them with different scenarios in different places, and really get to understand and ask the hard questions and then ask them again, right? Because also people often answer you with their aspirations, not with their actual practice. right? So how do you figure that out?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So I wanted to ask first, how do you keep the wave going? I feel like you kind of answered that already, but if you have more thoughts on that, that would be great. But the real question I wanted to ask is, once you've started a co-op and you've developed it, and you have a small group of people that are really excited and are doing the work, how do you maintain the culture within the co-op? How do you pass that culture on to generations of people that come after so that the co-op lasts 40, 50 years?
Right, great questions. How do we keep the wave going? Do I have anything more to say about that? It's a great question. Actually, I would put it back on the rest of you. How are we going to keep this wave going? I mean, I really think talking about it more, having more, opportunities for education. Oh, and making sure we involve young people. We're never going to keep it going if we don't involve young people. So involving young people from the beginning with real meaningful participation and control, right? Not just, superficial, oh yeah, we have young people, but they don't really make any decisions, right? So I think the young people, I think continuing to talk about innovative ways that we can use co-ops to address multiple problems and strategies, I think is important. So not feeling like we're rigidly, like even that grocery co-op model, it doesn't even have to be that rigid. A lot of grocery co-ops started out with buying clubs where people just pooled their resources to buy what they needed. And after a while, they could then move into having a retail store and that kind of thing, right? And then thinking out of the box of what the retail store could look like, right? In terms of whether, should we have other kinds of things happening, a demonstration kitchen, a kitchen that we rent out, right? The Detroit People's Food Co-op, I think it took 15 or 20 years before they actually opened the co-op store. They supported urban farming and a bunch of other stuff. Then slowly raised the money for their own building, and then they finally opened after that. So I think thinking out of the box about the different ways and how we could support each other, trying to get things like credit unions and other established co-ops to get involved in co-op development and supporting co-ops. So I think those, and thinking like community organizers, I can't say that enough, right? Rather than just thinking about urban planners, we need to think of ourselves as community organizers. And I think that'll make a difference. And then, the other part of your question was, the culture going, right. And that is a next problem, the succession planning, right? And so again, making sure young people are involved is very important. One of my favorite succession planning examples is Food from the Hood, which again, high school students, this time they had a school garden and they wanted to do more with their school garden. So they ended up starting first they gave the food away for free to the homeless. Then they realized they could sell their produce at a farmer's market in LA. And so they started doing a farmer's market. Then they realized they could do a co-op. They learned about value added in their business class, and so they started making salad dressing with some of the produce and selling that. And this was in the early 2000s. They actually also realized they could sell more salad dressing if they had a sales platform and not just selling at school. And so they joined the early Amazon and sold through Amazon. But they also, because they were students in the high school, they knew that in 4 years or 3 years they were graduating, right? In fact, the co-op was helping them to stay in school, and they were earning enough money. They voted half of their profits would go into college scholarship funds. So they knew they were going to be graduating and going to college. So what do? They went into the middle schools and started training the middle school students about both horticulture, so how to grow the stuff, and how to be in their co-op. So by the time the middle schoolers got into high school, They already had been exposed to the co-op. They were interested. They joined the co-op, and so then the seniors could leave, but they had new people coming in. So I think all of our co-ops should be thinking like that. So who are the new people? What, you know, and we need to make sure back to education and training. The co-ops that I know that lasted the longest and the strongest have fantastic continuous education and orientation programs. So all the new people get trained, they have buddies, they get exposure and experience so that if the older generation leaves or have to leave or whatever, they've got already have people who know and understand the culture, that kind of thing. And that buddy system also is really important. And you know, and then they also deal with, there are some issues which I don't really want to go into, but another succession planning issue is sometimes the older members of the co-op have a little bit more money invested in the co-op and so might be a little more conservative. So I've seen plans where you actually, after 3 to 5 years, you help people divest some of the money they have invested in the co-op. You give back to them in an extra dividend for longevity or whatever, so that they never have so much more money invested than the new people that they're worried about taking risks. But they've made the money back. You know, they get the money's in their pocket, so they haven't lost it by being in the co-op for a long time, but it's not stayed invested in the co-op, so that they're nervous about it. So there's those, you know, so you can get into all that financing kind of part, but really the education and training part is what's really important, and that planning ahead, right? So assume we're not always all going to be here, and assume that it's okay for other newer people to take control, but train them so that they can take control, right? Because I think the other problem is we all get to think we're indispensable, and the co-founders are like, oh, we know the most because we've been here the longest, and we have to give up all that stuff, right? We've got to share. We've got to make sure more people know what we're doing, why we're doing, and we got to listen because they have innovative ideas. The new people also have good innovative ideas that we have to be able to listen to.
Let's take one more question from the chat, and then it's gonna be just free reign for as long as we're in this building after this. But Khalil says this is inspiring information. The exponential growth of the co-op model is fascinating. I'm curious about what adaptations the cooperative model will experience due to AI. And then Lady T from 1DC added, AI is actually a wonderful component with developing structural and model of co-op. It's human creativity plus AI. It's a tool and weapon we can use. Any thoughts on that, Jessica?
Hi, T. Hi, T. Thanks for that. Yeah, I am not that good at AI, but what I'm realizing is it's kind of the same as anything else. It's about who controls it, right? And so co-ops, especially worker co-ops, are about the people who are doing the work being in control, right? Controlling the business, controlling how it's used. So I think we shouldn't be afraid of AI if we're talking about co-ops using them, and co-ops making sure that they really are democratic organizations, putting the people who are doing the work in power. But of course, that's easier said than done. But again, it's kind of the eternal vigilance we need to have. We need to make sure that we're operating, we're doing practicing economic democracy, and operating in a way that means we're sharing power, we're helping people to understand what collective leadership means, and therefore we're making decisions, even AI decisions that that are about how to increase productivity and help our members, rather than, right now AI is in the hands of capitalists who all they care about is making their profit. They don't care about workers or integrity, right? And that's the problem. If we care about each other, care about workers and integrity, we should be able to figure out when can we use AI, what's the best place to use it, how to use it, and when not to use it. Was there another part of that question? Okay.
Jessica, I was wondering, I really appreciate the acknowledgement of land and earth and the indigenous people of place. I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit about indigenous cultures and indigenous wisdom and how some of those cultures and that perspective can inform cooperative economics and cooperative development kind of in this moment.
I was about to say I don't have a lot, and then you gave me the confidence. So, yeah, I've studied this a little bit. I don't know it as well as I should, but definitely I've been my understanding of indigenous knowledge and indigenous culture and practices is both this reverence for stewardship and land stewardship and you know, 7th to 10 generation thinking, right, about how to steward, but also that many of the knowledge systems include the same similar principles and values that we talk about when we talk about cooperative economics, which I didn't even go over, but things like caring for other people, wanting sustainability, trusting other people, working together, that kind of thing. I do in the preface to the new edition, I actually have a quote about the highest form of courage is generosity. And I put that in there because when I read it, I was reading a book on indigenous knowledge, and I was thinking, okay, you know, I've written this book on collective courage, and I keep saying, you know, how important having the courage to do something differently, or now I talk about to go back to the way we used to do things, right? But having the courage to do that is difficult but necessary, and I think that I've chronicled a history of people having the courage, right, to do cooperative economics and to work with other people and to live up to ourselves as human beings, to work for prosperity for everybody or for the good, the common good. And then that quote about, you know, courage is really also about generosity. And I was thinking, okay, well, when you apply that to co-ops, to economics, right, that means that together, if we have collective courage to do this, then it also means we're willing to be generous, meaning not individualistic, right? Generous to each other and generous to our species, right? To make sure that our species survives. And so for me, that, you know, I think that's important, but also I've been embracing this notion of stewardship more, not just in terms of stewardship of the land, but really for me, all of economics is about stewardship. And that's not, like, my dad is 104, and I tried to have this conversation with him one day, and he couldn't see it. And actually, I just had this conversation with somebody else who's my age who couldn't see it either. They were like, no, 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 economics is about, right, managing the household, managing scarcity, this and that. And I'm like, but no, economics is really about stewarding our resources so that we can we can, what is it called? In economics, you call it social reproduction, right? So we can keep reproducing ourselves, so we can feed ourselves, house ourselves, feed our children, house our children, whatever, and survive and make it, right? And for me, economics is not about the competition of who can get the most and all that. Economics is about how do we as human beings stay human and practice economic systems that allow us to be human, and to be human in a way that we can all prosper. And that, to me, that's what stewardship is. And I think, you know, I've learned it not just from studying co-ops, but because I've been trying to look at indigenous knowledge and different kinds of ways of knowing and different kinds of how do we value, right, who we are, what kind of ways do we want to live in the world. And nowadays with climate change and stuff, it's not just how we work together as human beings, but we've got to figure out how to keep the planet livable. Because if we don't do that, it doesn't even matter whether we can reproduce ourselves as human beings, we won't be able to live as human beings. So again, that's another kind of stewardship. And to me, it's really co-ops. This is actually, I'm writing a new book, and this is kind of what my new book is about. Solidarity, cooperative economics is really the only way that we're going to survive as human beings through the next centuries, right? And if we don't embrace it and that notion of stewardship in all its levels, we're not going to survive. The planet is going to become unlivable for us. The planet will figure out. I mean, it'll still be here. It won't be the planet we know, and we won't be able to live in it. So we've got to figure out how can we keep it livable, and that again it's going to be cooperation and stewardship. I don't know if I really answered your question, Alex, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
Thank you so much. That was great. There's in the Spokane language, there's a word, and the word for generous and courage are the same word.
Oh, interesting.
It's the same word.
Let's give it up one more time for all of y'all, for Dr. Jessica. Yeah.
Great, also great questions. Great I mean, I love all of you nodding and making me feel like I was talking to real human beings and making some sense. So I really appreciate that too. Thanks everybody who's on the Zoom. I really appreciate you being there and being able to participate a little bit. And thank you, Kheprw, for having me. Really a pleasure to be here.
That concludes the guided part of our discussion. However, we aren't kicking anybody out until 9, so you got a little time to mix, mingle, grab another plate. Yeah, that's a great question. So if you go up to the front desk, Nas can help you go to our donation page. You can either do a one-time donation for the price of the book or become a recurring donor, and then you get your copy. I don't know, maybe if you catch Jessica and ask nicely, she'll personalize that copy for you. Yeah, so be sure to do that. That not only supports that helps us support our work. It helps us keep the lights in this building on, helps us, put on the next conversation. You'll also have a copy when you come back here next week for the next session of our book study. Once again, thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you again to, same time next week, same place, 6 to 8. I believe we're on chapter 3. Come ready to talk about that. One more shout out to all of our sponsors. Shout out to the Indianapolis Recorder for partnering with us with this event. Also, if anybody in this room sponsored and hasn't gotten their copy of the book yet, just let us know and we'll get you taken care of. Check out our newsletter, newsletter.kheprw.org. Sign up for Alkhemy Plus, alkhemy.kheprw.org. Thanks everybody for coming.